Good morning, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed the breakfast this morning, all organic. Yeah. And we're really pleased to be here at the University of Minnesota and glad that you all joined us for the 35th National Pesticide Forum. As I said last night, we hold this meeting really to energize the local movements that are going on around the country and communities. Someone approached me this morning and said, will there be a time where I can network with other people because I want to pass an ordinance in my community? And that's exactly what the purpose of this meeting is, to take all the science we're going to hear about this morning, to take the practical experience that we have seen in our communities, the practitioners who are practicing approaches to land management and structural pest management that do not poison or contaminate the environment. And the theme that has emerged in planning this conference and in our work really on a day-to-day basis is the challenge to deal with whole systems. We tend in our regulatory process, in the laws that we pass, we tend to be very reductionist in the way we look at nature, in the way we look at an impact of a pesticide on an organism. But as you can see by the range of authors we have at this conference, we really need to make as a society the shift to looking at whole systems. Organic has done that through organic systems plans, as Jim described last night, looking at the soil. Much of what we work on we don't see. David Montgomery's title of his book, The Hidden Half of Nature, speaks to the issue of what we don't see below the surface, in the soil. The lentil underground, we have some punsters amongst us in terms of their book titles. The lentil underground is not just about an underground agricultural movement that was bucking the industrial ag movement, but is about what is underground in the soil. And then Jeff Lowenfels, who will be speaking at lunch, has a whole series of books called Teeming with microbes, teeming with fungi, teeming with nutrients. Teeming, T-E-A-M, but what he really means is T-E-E-M-I-N-G. We need to nurture the organisms in the whole system. Now, this is not a new concept, as many of you know. Our challenge is to translate the new science, the emerging popular understanding of all of this into changes in our practices. So this morning we look at the science, and this afternoon we really hone in on the changes in practices. Rachel Carson talked about this in her book, Silent Spring. She implored us as a society to recognize that we are living with complex biological communities. That was her term. And so that was in the 60s. In the 40s, in the 1940s, the guy who we tend to think of as the father of organic, who wrote The Soil and Health, the study of organic agriculture in the 1940s, his approach, Sir Howard, he took the approach that soil is a living system and needed to be nurtured as such. So these concepts are not new to the scientific arena, but they are becoming popularized. Meanwhile, we have a regulatory system that allows all these chemicals on the market that we see in our communities, that are being used by our park districts, that are being used around our homes, that are being used on kids' playing fields, that certainly are being used in food production. And one of the things that has emerged in Minnesota, in particular, among the states, is this awareness that we are throwing these chemicals out there and adversely affecting pollinators, right? You all know about that. It's been an entry point for many in your communities, and Minnesota has led the way in terms of local ordinances and resolutions that have addressed this. The governor himself, in issuing an executive order back in August of last year, acknowledged that, in fact, pollinators were at risk And in that executive order directed the state agencies to come up with a plan. Now, we're struggling with what that plan will look like and to what degree we balance issues around pesticides and habitat and viruses, varroa mite and bacteria and whatever. These are complex biological communities. And yet, when EPA conditionally registered some of the neonicotinoids, guess what? They didn't do one field study in terms of the impact on pollinators, not one, and came up with a requirement that a field study be presented to the agency after the chemical was already put on the market. So we have learned, right, all of us that have become activists have learned that our regulatory system, good people in the regulatory system, you know, nice, our board meets with EPA at the highest level every year to talk about pesticides and issues around chlorpyrifos and neonicotinoids and specific chemicals that they're regulating and try to get them to think whole system in terms of the whole system. But in the course of doing that, you realize how far behind the curve they are. In January of this year, right before the administration's changed, EPA issued a preliminary risk assessment on one of the most widely used neonicotinoid insecticides, imidacloprid. And in that document, they said that the concentrations, this is current concentrations of imidacloprid in our nation's waterways, that's rivers, streams, and lakes, exceeds acceptable risk endpoints. Now, this is one of the most widely used chemicals on the market, and now here we are. This is a chemical that came on in the mid to late 90s. Beekeepers started complaining about it back then, and we've been going through this process. President Obama issued an executive order to begin evaluating these things. But here we are after all these years making a statement like that. And Canada, their pesticide division, has determined that current use of imidacloprid is not in agriculture and in land care is not sustainable, and is proposing to phase most, if not all, of its uses out. So there is a gap. We know that. We, as activists, as elected officials, as policymakers, we need to fill that gap. And that's why we're here. Because to the extent that we are educated, to the extent that we understand the science, we understand the uncertainties, we are more effective. And it is us. We are preaching to the choir here, but we're not preaching, we're teaching. We're teaching, how do we become more effective spokespeople? How do we go back to our communities? As Ronnie explained last night, all those, 500,000 different positions that we could be running for in our communities? How do we go back and either take on some of those positions or work with those in those positions, right? And that's what this conference is all about, because we know that one person can have a dramatic impact, not only in your community, but in your state and in the country. And we've seen that over and over and over again. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty on a lot of this. I know some folks will be frustrated by the short time frame that we've given to some of these illustrious speakers that we have today. We do that because our real point in being here is to give you face time with these folks in workshops. So all of these talks are followed by a workshop in which you can exchange ideas and talk to people face to face in an hour-and-a-half session. So let's use that opportunity, I think, effectively. So we're here to celebrate our victories, because there are a lot of victories in this room. We heard about some of those yesterday. I mean, the work going on in Illinois with resolutions to take back power at the local level to restrict pesticides more stringently than the state government after the state legislature has preempted the authority. What is more anti-democratic than that? You know, why is the governor of Maine, a conservative legislator, telling the state that the localities, and there are about 40 of them in Maine that have passed local ordinances, should not be allowed to restrict pesticides in their communities? We have to become conservative, like Jim says. Jim instructed us, speak the language. We are a conservative movement. We're asking for people to be conservative. with how we treat the environment and how we protect public health. So we're here to celebrate some of those victories. Speak up about your victories in the workshops. Explain how you got to where you are. And then we're here to face the challenges ahead. I mean, you know, we have a lot of challenges, right? We're going to recognize those challenges, and we will work with those challenges. I am so honored to be here with all of you. You are the lifeblood of change in your communities and in this country. I know that when I speak to one of you, I'm speaking to hundreds in your community because I know that you are a voice. And thank you for being here. I'd like to introduce our board president, who has been a voice for, in pediatrics and for children's health for decades, Rout Reigart from Medical University of South Carolina. And please give him a warm welcome, and then we'll move on to the speakers. Thank you so much.
So for those of you who were here last night, I'm still Rout Reigart. For those of you who weren't, I'm Rout Reigart. And I'm very excited about this program. I'm very excited to see so many of you here. I'm very excited, as I said last night, to be in Minnesota. I love this state, but I don't get here often enough, so this was a great excuse. And that's all I'm going to say, because I really want to get on to our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Don Huber, who is Professor Emeritus of Plant Pathology at Purdue. Without going through his whole CV, I just want to point out what he's been doing in the title of his talk. His agricultural research is focused on the epidemiology and control of soil-borne plant pathogens with emphasis on microbial ecology, cultural and biological controls, and physiology of host-parasite relations. The title of his talk is Disrupting the Integrity of Nature, Pesticides and Genetic Engineering. Dr. Huber.
Well, I'm honored to be here also. Really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of my research, but also research of a lot of other scientists that share common concerns. What you see here is a mural that's on the side of a cafe in Los Angeles. I have a grandson that's a surgeon in Los Angeles, and he said, "Grandpa, when you come and visit me, take you to one of the best dinners that you'll ever have." And I think it depicts a lot of what many of us feel, many of us would express relative to the genetic engineering and the many pesticides that it encourages and the increased load that we have in our food supply. And so I'll give you about a 30,000 foot view of that, and we'll go into it more as we get into the workshop. 25 years ago, we were told that genetic engineering will solve all of our problems. It'll take care of climate change, it'll take care of all the diseases and everything else. And now that we have 25 years to look back on it, we can see that every one of those promises is a failed promise. The reason for that is that we don't work in agriculture by silver bullets except in an emergency situation. Agriculture is managing an ecology, and that ecology involves the plant up the top, the physical environment, very dynamic biological environment, and then of course you have your pests and your pathogens. And it's the interaction of these four components that determine what the outcome's going to be. It's not just silver bullets for every little thing that comes up. And so as we look at that environment, then we can look and see what happens when we have or the consequences of that silver bullet approach like genetic engineering imposes on us. We see now that we have sick soils, we have a vanishing ecological support, we have deteriorating animal health, and we have increased human suffering because there isn't a single genetically engineered plant that's increased yield or quality. Every one of them has gone the other way when you disrupt the integrity of the genetic code. The entire concept of genetic engineering is fossil science, based on the concept of one gene, one function. We know that isn't the way genetics works now. When we sequenced the human genome, we had anticipated 100,000 genes. Turns out that we have just a few more genes than an earthworm. We have about 20,000. Earthworm has 18,000. The concept of one gene, one function, excuse me, isn't a process that goes on because our understanding of genetics now is that it's a physical relationship, a spatial relationship of genetic material in relationship to other genetic material. And we'll put it out in a two-dimensional form here so that when you insert additional genetic material, you change the spatial relationship. The other factor that we know influences the function of genetics is the environment. It changes as the environment changes. So that when you change the spatial relationship, you also change the environmental impact of that changed space. So that rather than just having one function for each gene, we may have hundreds of different functions that change because it works more like a Rubik's Cube. This is a tomographic view of what that nuclear material, genetic material, looks like in the cell. You look at all the spatial interactions. You can't change one thing without changing everything else as it interacts, not just in the ecology, but even down to the single level of the genetic base. So that we're changing all kinds of things that we've never seen before in science. We have new products that are produced that have never been understood or never been researched as far as their safety. And so it's a different system. Our knowledge of genetics is very primitive in that whole system. And there's nothing in the GE plant that does anything to the chemicals that we're adding and accumulating now in our food supply. So that when we look at genetic engineering, we also have to look at the chemicals that are being provided. But there are really two factors or two things that we have to understand. The first is the intended and the unintended consequences of the genetic changes. We haven't done that. We haven't required the physical and the safety studies on all of those changes. It's created some extremely hazardous conditions. In the L-tryptophan example, we have 80 people that died within the first 10 days of releasing that genetically engineered product that was produced. We have 10,000 that are permanently incapacitated from the anaphylactic shock from it. Nobody talks about any of those things. You can go on down the whole list. We need to understand what those new products are that are being produced. That 3-PAA, that is a very lethal biological warfare agent. That is a new product. Took us 12 years to even understand or find out what it was, because it had never been seen before in science, but it was produced by the bacteria as a consequence of engineering it to be more efficient in producing the L-tryptophan. We need to understand the toxicity of the chemicals now that are in every cell of the plant or that are accumulating in the plant. We've used a lot of those for years before. We've never had them applied and accumulating in the plant itself. It's a different environment. There are different structures associated with them. We need to look at all of those and do the safety testing that each genetic engineering event is a unique event. We don't have the knowledge to reproduce any single one. We may get the same end product that we're looking for, but we don't get the secondary products the same with each event. Each event is a unique characteristic. Animals can tell the difference. These, what you see here, are isogenic lines. This is a triple stack, genetically engineered from this parent corn. These 2 bags were left in the back of the warehouse. Cleaning out the warehouse, and you can tell which one the mice preferred. Left the other one clean. Then Gilbert Hostetler, the seedsman, said, "Maybe those mice are telling me something that I ought to know." They are. The 2 ears up here, again, this is a triple stack, genetically engineered. This is the parent line. Those ears stayed up in the tree for 9 months. You can see which ones the squirrels preferred. Even during the winter, they got a little hungry and they'd nibble. Didn't like that stomach ache. Had a farmer come up before my presentation in Florida. And he said he was there only because his wife insisted on it, because he thought that genetically engineered sweet corn was the greatest thing since sliced bread. I said, "Why is it so great?" He said he's grown sweet corn for 30 years, shipped it to the Yankees up north. Said it's the first year that his raccoons didn't take a single ear. And so you want to feed that to your kids and your grandkids. They can tell the difference probably because of the formaldehyde that accumulates when you disrupt the integrity of the genetic code. One of the systems that is shut down is C1 metabolism. With C1 metabolism, that's how we get rid of waste products. Formaldehyde is one of those natural waste products that's almost instantly removed through the C1 metabolism. With the blockage of that, you have an accumulation of formaldehyde, a category 1 carcinogen. When formaldehyde builds up, it depletes your glutathione. That's your immune system. Why do you think we have all the diseases, all the sickness that we have now? Because we don't have that immune system in a functional relationship. You see then the chemicals that we're applying and the quantity that's going out. We use about 300 million pounds of glyphosate in this country in agriculture, and almost an equal amount then for non-agricultural uses, for roadsides and right-of-ways, waterways and other sources. But you can see the stimulation then that the genetic engineering provided and the consumption and the application and indiscriminate use of this very simple but very complex chemical that was first patented as a mineral chelator to clean boilers and steam pipes. Chelates all of your cations, very broad spectrum chelator. That was in 1964. In 1974, Monsanto recognized it as a very broad spectrum herbicide. It's a broad spectrum herbicide because it's a broad spectrum chelator, and these mineral ions are the essential cofactors for physiological functions. In 2010, Monsanto also patented as a very broad spectrum antibiotic. This antibiotic is an antibiotic against the beneficial organisms. Our pathogens are over 4,000 times less sensitive to glyphosate than our beneficial organisms that we rely on in our GI tract or in the environment to provide those minerals for us and to produce the aromatic amino acids that we have to have that we can't produce ourselves. It's a very persistent material. A half-life in soil can be anywhere from 1.5 years to as long as 22 years. We're talking generations in some of our soils before it's eliminated without some extra help. The carbon phosphate lyase that's required to degrade glyphosate is extremely rare in nature. It's a synthetic amino acid, has many other physiological functions that have only rarely been looked at and been studied. A very unique compound. It interferes with nutrient uptake. We have a lot of factors there. You can see that reduced nutrition that's available in the plant and in the seed. Farmers will say, well, my crops aren't as vigorous as they used to be. They're starving. They don't have those micronutrients to carry them on, and the consequence is that we have over 40 plant diseases now and 32 human and animal diseases that we see reaching epidemic proportions that didn't exist or weren't a problem for us with our old controls. We no longer experience that or have those effective controls. We see that the genes are very promiscuous. You see it with the Roundup Ready creeping bent grass that's now an invasive weed in Idaho and Oregon and Washington, spreading out into the Pacific now. We know how to get the genes in, we don't know how to get them out. And so we have many more problems. University of Wisconsin just released a study that says that 1/3 of a pound of phosphorus going into Lake Erie every year, or goes in from every acre of soil in the watershed going into Lake Erie, but 1/3 of a pound of phosphorus comes from glyphosate. It's no longer being tied up. We've already saturated that system. We see colony collapse disorder in the bees. All three of those factors responsible for colony collapse disorder are a function of glyphosate. Then you tie glyphosate with the neonicotinoids as another endocrine hormone disrupting chemical. Lauren Pang tells us that when you have two endocrine hormone disrupting chemicals, it's not a 1 + 1 = 2. It's a 1 + 1 = 30,000 times more damage when you're looking at the endocrine hormone disruptors. It's a very potent antibiotic to your gut microbiome. Bees have to have lactobacillus and bifidobacteria in the honey crop in order to digest that food. They're starving to death while they have plenty of honey and bee bread in the hive because they don't have the organisms there. In a normal honey crop, it's a very viscous material. It's being digested. It's being used. You can see in Amos's study here, when those bees are foraging on the GMOs with the glyphosate, it's just like a bunch of gravel accumulating then in the honey crop. Can't utilize it, those tissues are starved. We see the quantity of glyphosate that's in our food. It's almost immoral to look at it. And the USDA refuses to do the analysis because they know what those levels are and what's happening. We see it to our youth and our wildlife. You see all of those consequences then from the endocrine hormone disruption and the mineral deprivation that we have in those tissues. We have the studies showing the allergy response to the new proteins. This is a GMO. These are pig stomachs. These would be what ours look like. Our healthy stomach would look like this. This is what it looks like when we're eating GMO foods. You see those ulcerations. You see the deterioration of the gut linings and all of the diseases then that go along with it that we see. And then you see the tragedy that's going on in Yakima that everybody's been censored on with the threat from the federal government of violation of privacy if we talk about it. Started adding Roundup a rodeo to the water for invasive weed control in 2008, and look at what happens to anencephaly. You also have the spinal bifida, you have the cleft palate, you have all of the other deformities now in our children. Nobody's permitted to talk about it and to explain what's happening and what you need. And yet, if you look at Steve Drucker's book on altered genes, twisted truth, and I'd recommend this to all of you. Steve says how the venture to genetically engineer our food has subverted science, corrupted government, and systematically deceived the public. And you see the collusion and corruption that's in the system and why we have the problem that we have today. And so you see that these two systems, the genetically engineered program and the chemicals that we're using, are all impacting everything that we value in life. And to summarize, as I've said before, the future historians may well look back and write about our time, not about how many pounds of pesticides we did or did not apply, but about how willing we are to sacrifice our children and jeopardize future generations with this massive experiment that we call genetic engineering, that's based on false promises and flawed science just to benefit the bottom line of a commercial enterprise. Many thanks.
Carla gets the applause. That was a great talk, terrific talk. Very slight shift now. Our next speaker is Vera Krishik. She's a tenured faculty in entomology at the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Sciences, the University of Minnesota. She got her PhD at the University of Maryland. Since 1998, she has been director of the Center for Sustainable Urban Ecosystems that promotes sustainable landscapes and conservation of beneficial insects. In 2010 and 2014, she received a legislative citizen commission on Minnesota Resources Grant for mitigating pollinator decline. I wish